So good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the third event in our 2015-2016 Clough series on the arts and the culture of democracy. Our thanks to the vision and support of Chuck Clough and Vlad Perdue for making this possible. This evening is part of a larger conversation nationwide and here at BC about the arts and their relationship to politics and law. Tonight, we focus on the role of contemporary visual arts in creating, defining, and critiquing the American democratic vision, encouraging us to pause and reflect on the lovely and unlovely in our body politic, making explicit what is already implicit in the American landscape. The visual arts draw our attention to the act of seeing and transfigure what is seen in ways that suggest new patterns in our relationships and institutions. We'll continue this conversation on the interdependence of the arts and democratic culture for one more event this spring. If you'd like to mark your calendars, on April 21st, the event will be on music, and joining us will be our ever wonderful Ed Hirsch, Carla Rotella, Kim Koshkoshian, that's Kim Koshkoshian, and Scott Polson-Bryant. This evening, in keeping with our usual format, we'll keep the introductions very short. We always have fascinating speakers whom we could talk about at length, so we've given you full bios in the program. If you don't have a program, this is a good time to raise your hand if you'd like one. So you can get a sense of the sterling qualifications of the conversationalists we have in front of you. As always, our wonderful moderator, Ed Hirsch, will guide the conversation, in which he'll be joined by Liza Lou on his left, Ramiro Gomez on his right, and Lawrence Weschler. Welcome to you all.
Hey everybody, it's good to see you. Here with two terrific artists and one of our best critics about art, thinkers about contemporary art. We've had 5 events so far on the arts and culture of democracy. In somewhat of a tortured way, I've managed to turn every one of those conversations towards poetry. Eager to do that again tonight. Our ostensible subject is visual art and its relationship to democracy. Ren is going to introduce our 2 really great artists, and they're going to say something about their work. I thought I'd say something about part of the American project in art, which is an inclusive project, and a project somewhat distinctive from the European project. First of all, though, I want to say Paul Valéry, a great French poet, says, "We should apologize that we dare to speak about painting." I think it's important to recognize that we're always traducing an abyss, we're crossing a divide when we're talking about visual art. We're turning one language into another language, and the verbal language is not exactly its own medium. And so I think we should be aware that we're honoring a medium and talking about it in another form that changes it. Yet Valéry also says there are important reasons for not keeping silent, since all the arts live by words. Each work of art demands its response. And I would go even further and quote Baudelaire to say, "One of the symptoms of the spiritual condition of our age is that the arts aspire, if not to take one another's place, at least reciprocally to lend one another new powers." And this I'm just going to say for one moment, this is where poetry comes in its relationship to visual art. There's a long tradition in poetry of what the Greeks called ekphrastics or ekphrasis, which is tradition of writing about art or creating a verbal equivalent for art, not simply responding to it, but creating something in response to it. It begins with Homer's description of the shield of Achilles, and it goes on from there. One of the most interesting things about that example, the oldest example of ekphrastic art, is that we don't actually have the shield of Achilles. What we have is Homer's description of it, which actually replaces the visual art, the work of visual art in this case. But what has been undergirding a lot of our conversations over the last 2 years has been a somewhat Emersonian idea of what makes, what's the American consciousness. And Emerson says, we live by abandonment. And the most important aspect of Emerson's thinking is what he called fluctuations in mobility, and that we were always in transit. And one of the features of the Emersonian ideal in music, in poetry, in art, has been a project that has emphasized more the process of making than the product itself, and has distinguished between the transitional movements and the actual art product. This is an idea that comes right out of Dewey, Art as Education, that there's a difference between the product itself, the result of the work, and the process that gets us to the work. That's why I think that abstract expressionism or action painting is one of the most American examples of art that we've had in the 20th century. Because the canvas in abstract expressionism becomes the arena rather than the product. It's not that one begins with an image and sets out to copy that image. It's that the work itself is the progress of thinking through the experience. Barnett Newman said, "The sublime is now." That's a very American idea. It has its flaws, which is the way we leave behind the past. Our, I would say, ahistorical thinking. And some of our artists now have tried to correct that ahistorical thinking. But it's also led to this art of fluxions and mobility, of movement, of transit, of action. So words as deeds. The work of art is a deed itself. So thanks.
Right. Thank you, Ed. Damn, so I can't use poetry? Well, I won't start with poetry, except just a first reaction to what you were just saying. Ramiro and I had a lovely afternoon at the Boston ICA at the Black Mountain College show. How many of you have been there? Okay, you put your hands up. Everybody who wasn't there, put your hand up. So you are the people who have to go there, because it's a terrific show. But it's partly precisely around a place that existed briefly for 10 years, basically, and was Dewey intoxicated.
Yeah.
Intoxicated with the notion that it wasn't, that experience is not where you get knowledge, but reflecting on experience. What of Dewey's? And the people who were all there pretty much at the same time include everybody from Rauschenberg and Albers and Fenninger was there, and Annie Albers and
Olson and
Charles Olson and Robert Duncan and Robert Creeley and Morris Cunningham and John Cage and David Tudor, and everybody was there at this little tiny podunk college in North Carolina, and what they did, the sense of what's possible from that kind of energy is worth going to look at. But anyway, so I won't quote a poem for starters. What I will quote is some lines from the late and truly great American political writer Jonathan Schell. And some of you of a certain age will remember when he had a remarkable set of pieces in the New Yorker at a point when Reagan had recently come to power and was trying to put nuclear weapons into Western Europe, Pershing missiles and so forth, and he wrote a long essay which was published as a book called The Fate of the Earth, which is terrifically prescient because the kinds of things he was writing about go directly from nuclear power and nuclear weapons to all the general crisis of technology and finally global warming, which is what he was writing about at the end. But all the way back then in 1981, he wrote these remarkable lines. Two paths lie before us. One leads to death, the other to life. If we choose the first path, we in effect become the allies of death, and in everything we do, our attachment to life will weaken. Our vision, blinded to the abyss that has opened at our feet, will dim and grow confused. Our will, discouraged by the thought of trying to build on such a precarious foundation anything that is meant to last, will slacken, and we will sink into stupefaction, as though we were gradually weaning ourselves from life in preparation for the end. On the other hand, if we reject our doom and bend our efforts toward survival, then the anesthetic fog will lift. Our vision, no longer straining not to see the obvious, will sharpen. Our will, finding secure ground to build on, will be restored, and we will take full and clear possession of life again. One day, and it is hard to believe that it will not be soon, we will have to make our choice. What I want to point out to you in that passage is the language of vision. Everything in that passage is about what happens to our vision when we strain not to see what's right in front of us, what by contrast happens when our vision is cleared, when we are allowed to see the world as it is, infinite. That's Blake, when the doors of perception are cleansed. But more, and it seems to me especially important when talking about America, but even more fundamentally when talking about democracy. It just seems to me at the end of the day, this is a series of talks about the arts and democratic practice. And the importance in this context of people who are professionals at vision, which is to say our visual artists. I mean, you could think about vision in terms of poetic vision, in terms of reporter's vision and so forth, but at the end of the day, those are all near approximations of the people who have it, who really, really have it as their first task. And that's why I am often drawn in my writing, and I have been drawn, especially with the two people we're going to have today, to art that is extraordinarily powerful on its own terms, is often remarkably beautiful, remarkably balanced, celebratory, any number of things. But it also, it seems to me, taps into fundamental things about democracy, democratic process. One other observation I make before I introduce the two is that the visual arts, for all that, are entrammeled and entangled in the market, which often is a profoundly anti-democratic institution in this society. And it seems to me that's something that both of these artists are kind of working with, that it's something that poets don't have to worry about that much.
That's for sure.
And let me tell you, journalists don't either. But that oddly enough, to me, it's been completely fascinating the way that the art since the 19th century has been a series of attempts to find ways of democratizing the artwork, and they just can't do it. Prints. There was a time when the reason you had prints was that they would be affordable to everybody, and that there became home market in prints. Photographs, that ought to be possible. You ought to be able to take photographs, and then everybody could have. Oh, no, there's photographs, But
posters. There are posters.
So there are posters, but even those
Postcards.
Postcards.
So capitalism is successful.
Well, but capitalism is problematic in all the arts, but especially so in work, and then also, and it seems to be very especially interesting for me with these two artists, the problem of elites, and that in most of, I mean, who gets to go to the museum, who gets to be portrayed in the museum, who gets to have a sense of belonging, that can become problematic, especially in a world where, and by the way, this isn't just the United States, this goes back to the Medicis, where the bankers are the collectors. That's always been the case, that wherever you had capital began to turn art into commodity and so forth. And so it seems to me in an interesting way that those are some thoughts that might pertain to the two artists that we'll be hearing from today. First we'll hear from Ramiro, and then for 5 or 7 minutes or something, and then Liza Lou, and then we'll turn into a conversation, and then into a wider conversation. Ramiro is a remarkable young artist. I hope many of you have had a chance to see some of his work next door, but he is based in Los Angeles. Well, why don't you just introduce yourself?
I guess I'll go up to the podium.
Yeah, go up to the podium and me just show you how you get it. I'll show you if you press that down, then your name shows up right there.
Perfect. And it just goes side to side, right? Hi, guys. So, Ramiro Gomez, that's my name. And yes, I am an artist that is practicing actually a very interesting form of art that could be labeled guerrilla style street art. My work deals with domestic labor, as you may or may not have seen next door, and the domestic labor inside spaces that sometimes isn't necessarily portrayed in the arts. It proves that exhibiting this and getting the reaction that it has, it's a necessary visual statement that in this modern day time easily gets lost. The thing that is interesting is I find magazines such as this, Luxe and interior decorating magazines, and I paint directly onto them. So that's my canvas. There's other examples of the same essential domestic woman working and at the same time portrayed in different ways, real and imagined. These are examples of imagined scenes, reflections. What is a reflection? Who is reflected in these art pieces? It's not always domestic labor that I'm working with. I sometimes work in ways that bring attention to labor itself, just labor in the international sense, the fashions that we wear, where it comes from. I'm very interested in the amounts of hands that go into objects. And so it's not any coincidence that I chose magazines, which themselves go through hands, many hands, and just mirror and reflect. So in this case here, repetition of the woman working at a station, eventually becoming this fashionable dress that isn't portrayed in the actual ad is what I'm interested in focusing back on, and the attention of the viewer more so. Sometimes it's not figurative, it sometimes is experience-based work. So in this case here, it's an example of my paycheck series in the magazine, where I'm not interested so much of painting the figures, but at the same time thinking about what it means to be paid
For people who can't read
in these moments. And yeah, I think that the idea of what this is, for those that you can't read, it's a Post-it note saying Maria, 8 hours equals $80, and her check next to it. It's a disconnect between the labor done, sometimes out of love, sometimes extending what the actual boundaries are of your job, and at the same time, the realities of how difficult it is to even engage with this for both the employer and the employee. It's not easy to pay
You worked
the
as a
labor.
nanny yourself, right?
And I worked as a nanny, so my experience is what comes into play here. I worked in a home where I was paid in a very similar sense. So I'm not interested in art that is disconnected. In fact, I'm interested in art that is of experience. Then beyond it, going into the actual real world, experiences like this are common in Beverly Hills, California, near where I live in West Hollywood. And these are cardboard cutouts, figures gardening, figures cleaning, pruning hedges are very common sights there. And I reflect it back, simply done through cardboard that I source out of the dumpsters in the neighborhood and put them back in front of homes, guerrilla style, just to make sure that you're aware that this isn't necessarily just something that you should bypass each day, but make it. So,
If I could just comment on this one in particular, when you see it, what you suddenly realize is that you see these people all the time and you don't notice them. The anesthetic fog.
sure.
And what's remarkable is a cardboard cutout, so you say, whoa! And then you start seeing them everywhere, the actual people.
I think, again, it's very important to pause and have someone have an experience of art unexpectedly, and that's what I try with this project. So this example here is in the next room over, and it, again, is referencing art. It's updating something that is very much a part of the visual language and culture, and then updating it, thinking about Las Meninas being the caretakers of the princess in this case, in the Diego Velázquez famous painting, and thinking of the modern day caretakers in these places. So I think that one of my favorite parts about this conversation we're having is where this artwork is actually being seen and how it's being seen. This isn't in an institution. It's definitely not something that is being invited to do. But in fact, it's me democratically going into these spaces that are technically public. It's the front of the space. So what is the border, and who's coming in to see this space actually is my intended target, because they will see this beautiful home and come away with an experience, and their takeaway is this beautiful home. But at the same time, I think that art needs to get back into these spaces, and the power of art is obvious to me in the reactions to this project. Using magazines, as I said, and cardboard, found objects that are my goal of art making. Well, again, going forward, this is another example of a project I do in Arizona. The actual desert, again, extending what it is to be a laborer, not only the person making the effort to work, but actually where they're coming from to work. These examples connecting the desert cardboard experience to David Hockney's iconic A Bigger Splash are my ways of reflecting images that are well known and locations that are well known, but at the same time updating them in very simple ways, focusing just on my own visual language, the figures that I see.
That one's called American Collectors, and this is called American Gardeners.
Which, by the way, was exhibited at Expo Chicago near the Art Institute of Chicago, where the original is. So that is probably one of my favorite moments, actually, of exhibiting a painting like this. Again, my experiences are what I'm trying to reflect, and in my case, as I grow as an artist, no longer working as a full-time live-in nanny, but now as an artist operating through the example on the right that you see, Art Basel Miami Beach's advertisement for their fair, are things that I'm interested. The custodian is a very natural progression for me to go from a domestic laborer, using different forms of technology to update again, always finding the same ways of saying interesting things, because no matter where we go, I find this labor happening. The cast is different, but the role ends up being the same. Two different experiences here of new work that I've been doing. An example of a custodian inside Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and a gardener in front of a Paul Smith store in Los Angeles that's very iconic. So examples of me taking the same idea and not necessarily using art reference so much as the cultural reference, locations, always using this work to think about what it means to do work that is ephemeral and represent, again, people that are not supposed to exist in art or art history.
Can you just finally, one last thing before you get off, talk about the worker that you worked with who never went to galleries and then your opening?
Yeah, well, the thing is, when I go back into the experience of exhibiting work, the worker that I worked with, a housekeeper named Leticia, would always communicate to me that she liked art and she didn't see herself portrayed in this kind of work. And at the same time, in the neighborhood that she worked in, Beverly Hills, she would see gallery spaces and would often want to go into these spaces herself, but didn't feel comfortable enough. And she would share that with me at home, but I wasn't making artwork about her yet. And once she started seeing my work just being done in this bedroom that I shared at the home, and she would ask me questions about, oh, this work is great, and she would tell me that this work was enjoyed by her, I started telling her that there's ways of her going into the spaces, yet, again, there's so many things that have happened since where now I realize what she was trying to communicate. She didn't feel comfortable enough to go into the art spaces. And so my work is actually of bringing people like her into this space, and that's coming out more and more. She has since actually gone to my exhibition opening of this iconic painting where she is a housekeeper technically. And that experience is an ongoing process for me to learn and figure out what it means for me to be a former nanny, now working in art spaces and growing from it. So.
Great. Thank you. We'll talk more in a second. Liza? Liza also starts in LA, let's say, in her artwork, and ends up somewhere altogether different.
Hello. I don't think there's anything here yet. Well, it's a really,
down there.
the down is takes it forward. I guess to talk about my work is to talk about process and time.
Can you hear her okay?
And I'm very interested in
And adjust the mic.
thinking about,
Yeah.
whoops, put this on here. I'm interested in thinking about time as an art material as much as anything else. And when I started out as an artist, I began by using glass beads, and I had this thought that maybe I could make a kitchen. And I thought it would take about 2 months to make, and it ended up taking me 5 years. I set out to describe an environment through objects, and I wondered if objects could describe or tell a story about claustrophobia.
How big is this?
It's about 168 square feet.
So it's the size of a kitchen.
It's the size of a, kind of country-style kitchen. Because we have poets in the house, I'll tell you that you can't see it here, but there's an Emily Dickinson poem on the side of the oven, and the poem is. I'll tell you the small print of the poem. It's, if aught she missed in her new day of amplitude or awe, or first perspective, or the gold in using wore away, it lay unmentioned as the sea develops pearl and weed, but only to himself is known the fathoms they abide. So I think, in a way, what I was trying to do was make a monument to a woman who maybe was living in the 19th century and who had fathoms inside of her and yet found herself baking pies. And so could you just make the most extraordinary pie? Or if she was washing dishes for all eternity, I wanted to make a work of art that kind of honored that labor that perishes with the using, endless kind of work that, you wash a dish and it gets dirty again and over and over and over and over again. So in the process of making this work, I kind
These
of...
are all individual beads, do you understand?
So in the process of making the work, I think I kind of fundamentally changed as a person, because I wasn't necessarily someone given to slow, painstaking work, but yet I was very, very interested in curious about what this would look like, and so that curiosity kind of kept me going on the project over and over again, and it changed me in the sense that, working on one object or one work of art for 5 years made me think about time in a different way. And so actually making this particular image, looking at the sink, I wondered what would happen, what would you see when you looked out the window? And the thought was you would see a lawn. And so my next project was to make a 530 or so square feet backyard. And every blade of grass is made out of beads, and they're thread with wire. And I worked with the community, because when I finished the kitchen, I had all of these physical ailments. It's embarrassing to say, but I did. I had tendinitis and all these things. So I realized that if I did this next project on my own, it would take about 40 years.
How many blades of grass?
Yes, just to make the grass alone.
How many blades?
It worked out to be about 250,000,
Yeah, okay.
which is, yeah. But it's interesting, too, because I'm not very mathy, and anything to do with numbers gets very jumbled for me. So I have this kind of two things working in my favor. One is that I'm not good at math, and the other is I have very, very, very bad eyesight. So my visual field is very close up. So for me, I often like to imagine if I were living in the 19th century, this is precisely the work I would do, because it would all that I would be able to see. So
And
it's
how
got...
many people worked with you?
I think we worked, it was an interesting project, because I worked with the Santa Monica Museum, and they set up a place for me in a shopping mall, and so people could come and make blades of grass and then go on their way and do their shopping. So it was very, very egalitarian. I don't know how democratic it was, but it certainly involved a lot of people. It wasn't democratic in the sense that I was, as much as I had lots of people working, I was still kind of a control freak. I thought about that lawn as a painting, and I was placing each blade of grass and making a visual field. Another major project I did was a trailer. This is a 40-foot long mobile home that I gutted the interior of, and then I wanted to describe a male landscape, and so I made it in a black and white kind of film noir feeling. And unfortunately, you know, so many people today, and all of us, we look at art through a glass lens or on a screen, and you're not having the physical experience of these works. And what fascinates me and what you're not getting when I show slides, and I actually hate showing slides, just to tell you, I normally like to just sing gospel songs when I'm asked to talk. But the thing is that you're not having, you know, beads themselves, this thing that I'm interested in, they're three-dimensional by themselves, so they already are sculpture. So to see them on a flat screen is to completely lose the physicality of the material. But oh well, we'll make do. So I'm going to rush ahead because we only have a few minutes, but I was working with beads maybe for about 15 years and thinking of them as a means to an end. In other words, I wasn't very respectful about what the material was culturally or historically. I wasn't interested in craft. At least I didn't think I was. I thought I was interested in creating a landscape, a world, and this small glass material happened to kind of remind me of something else, like pixelated kind of fantasy. But then I got onto this idea that what would happen if I, rather than working with graduate students in my studio, what would happen if I worked with people who did have an indigenous relationship to this material? Because certainly there are those people in other parts of the world. So it led me to this idea of making a chain link fence. What I was setting out to describe here was really thinking about America and the American landscape, and thinking about the 2 million people that are incarcerated in our country, and how a prison cell or a chain link enclosure is very much describes a kind of claustrophobia. But I went to Africa to make this piece, which is very ironic. I went to South Africa, and I went to Durban, and I made this project working with Zulu women. And the funny thing about it is I had all of these ideas in my mind about what this piece meant, but I hadn't really considered what a chain link fence might mean to post-apartheid South Africa. But naively, I kind of went into this country with this idea that I would work with Zulu women for a period of a few months, and it would put food on the table in a meaningful way, hopefully, for people who were maybe really, really needed the work and who had a relationship with beads. This is another...
You see, this is all beaded. Every surface here is beaded, just so.
But the interesting thing, too, about this project
including
is...
the barbed wire.
You know, how do you bead, if you think about, how would you apply beads to chain link or to razor wire? And it has this impossibility, and I think that's one of the things that, as an artist, I'm really always interested in, is the impossible. You know, something that just seems like it would just about kill you. But what I found out instead was working with these extraordinary women. Within minutes, all of my ideas kind of clattered to the floor in terms of what it meant to help, the pride implicit in the idea of helping other people. And I realized that they were really helping me more than anything. And for example, if you don't have a song to sing, you're just sad. That's kind of what. And if you don't have a story to tell, they think of you as kind of impoverished. And so as we would sit and be doing this project together, they would be telling stories, and stories that were just extraordinary about their lives, and very sophisticated way of telling a story as well. There was a very musical way of telling stories. So I'm still working there. It's been 10 years. And the same women that I started with 10 years ago, I still work with now. And the work has changed because of my relationship to that place. And what you're seeing here in this black kind of relief that you're seeing on the table, what we're doing is we're applying beads one at a time. We're balancing them on their tips with tweezers, which is kind of insane. Because all around us, outside the windows, there's chaos and very, very difficult environment. And And at one point working, in fact, not long after this picture was taken, I had a kind of breakthrough, a realization that I was not listening to my environment. I was still coming up with my ideas of what I wanted to make and not really listening to the place. And I wasn't letting it break my heart in the ways that it seemed to insist upon doing. I kept insisting that the work be seen a certain way or be a certain way rather than just letting it collapse. This is a project that we're making, these blades of grass. So going back to the backyard, I had an idea, well, now that I have a crew of lots of people, wonder if I could make 1 million blades of grass, and how long would that take? And so this is a project called Gather 1 Million, and it is 1 million blades of grass. So when I look at the backyard, the earlier work, and I see the 250,000, I think, huh. But again,
Americans are such wusses.
it's a way of also making a painting. So I'm very interested in loss of control and having many people help, and yet absolute control, almost down to the nano hair, of where each blade of grass is placed. This is another project I did. It's on view now, actually, in New York at the Neuberger Museum. It's called Color Field, and it's a 1,500 square foot environment. And I'm really interested, I have to admit, and maybe it's kind of embarrassing, but I am interested in how things look, in the visual experience. I'm really comforted to know Emerson wasn't opposed to that. So that idea that what we look at can, the idea that I don't know, there can be some sense of joy, hopefully. I don't know if you can really see it in that picture. This is this is a project, I've got 2 more slides here to show you, and it's very close to my heart, and it's what I mean when I talk about works that can allow for heartbreak or mistakes. You can't really see it from this picture, but Renzo nicely put together this picture. Each one of those, I call them paintings, but they're woven, are made of one color each, and what you see when you see any differentiation in each canvas, it's actually made from the human hand. It's just the sweat of the hand that's creating these streaks. So the gray that you see on the left, it's all one manufactured, perfectly round glass bead made in Japan. And yet when you bring it to into environments at home where people have them in rural areas, the oil, the sweat of the hand, the dirt, whatever's happening with children, with families, changes and embeds the work with the kind of pathos of the human hand. And so that's kind of the work that I'm really presently engaged with. And this is just an image showing working at home in the townships. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'll gather here.
I'm sitting.
And maybe you have some comments to start
Love
with.
seeing the work. I thought poets are strange. I mean, you people are crazy. I mean, I thought we were obsessive.
Yeah.
I thought we were obsessive. I love the work. The work is thrilling. And I'm really struck by 2 things. One, the first thing is artists really know how to make things that are beautiful, and that you're still trying to make something beautiful. And that there's a tremendous, I mean, it's not journalism. It's something else. It's really trying to be art. And then it's got a tremendous political dimension. And the dimension seems to me, in both cases, because you're working in such different modes and mediums, it seems to me that you're making, I really was struck by this when I first saw, I didn't actually see or read about images of the kitchen. I saw the, not itself the kitchen, but the representations of it. And your work is, in your case, you just feel women's labor, and you feel women who've been invisible. I felt as if I were reading Willa Cather, or those tremendous 19th century local histories that you get now of women in Kansas and Iowa and Nebraska. We're just completely invisible to the pioneer women, and we're just desolately lonely. And you feel that even though they're not actually represented. Of course, in your work, I mean, you're actually literally putting in people who just haven't been represented before. It seems to me that the combination of making something literally visible that's been invisible is really a tremendous amount of the work of visual art and what you can. Does this make sense to you? Is it?
It's an interesting thing. I was somewhere, speaking of loneliness, when I work in South Africa, often there's a kind of loneliness. And I think there's a loneliness to making art anyway, because you're obsessed or interested in something that you have a feeling no one else would be, and then you also feel that you might be slightly crazy. So there's a couple things going on. But at one point I was working in South Africa on the security fence, and there was a woman visiting with a Fulbright scholarship, and I said, oh, I've got to show you what I'm doing. And I'm not usually that kind of, but I was sort of lonely, so I dragged this woman up to see my studio and show her the thing, and she looked at it, and she stood there, and then she goes, will there be any text? And I tried to say, I hope that the work, that the labor, or that the story of it is implicit, that you don't have to, it doesn't really need to be text.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because in my work, I'm engaging on the opposite. Sometimes text is not what I choose. I choose the visual, the image of the labor, right? And that's
Universal.
I've had experiences where people come to me and
They'll say, I love your work.
or I'll get messages, sometimes in broken English from people
Seeing it in Bangladesh.
saying, your work is interesting, or something to the sort. And I find that use of text sometimes is not necessary, but other times in the magazine work especially, when the text is there, Art Basel, it adds context, it adds impact, it actually is part of it, and so that's a choice that I engage with.
For example, with the Art Basel piece, I mean, there are almost as many custodians at a art fair as there are millionaires.
Yeah.
I was just at Miami Art Basel. I actually heard the following statement. One person talking to another, and this was not said ironically. One person walking by, hundreds of people walking around, and one person says to another, the thing I really love about these fairs are the shoes. And no kidding, that's what those fairs are about. It's people, people don't go to the fairs to look at things, they go to be looked at and to show off their shoes. But then the other thing that's quite amazing, you don't see it unless you're walking around with Ramiro, which I had occasion to do at the Mexico City Art Fair, is there are really, literally almost as many custodians and people, because, well, you had a great line in the text about like any casino. Do you remember what you said?
The casino aspect is just, it needs to be constantly maintained. I mean,
It has to be clean. Nobody at a casino wants to see any trash.
The trash
And this is a casino.
exactly.
And like any casino, he said to me, they have, and so these custodians are walking around so that anybody who puts down the plastic champagne glass or the little paper caviar holder or whatever
It's
it
gone in
is,
seconds.
it has to be gone immediately, and you don't see them. It's really amazing. And then you go put that on the cover,
Yeah.
and that's what's going on in that show. That's what's really going on.
Well, in Sonamaco, which is what he was explaining, Sonamaco is a big Latin American art fair that I got
A chance to exhibit in last year.
and
The fascinating thing is that it's Mexico, right?
and my family comes from Mexico. My family emigrated from Mexico, so to be back in the capital
Exhibiting work
was a very interesting experience, and not just exhibiting work, but actively participating, being there, taking it all in and letting it inspire new work, which eventually did. I, in fact, trailed a lot of the janitors. That's where my eye went. And as an artist in an experience like that, most artists stay away clearly from an art fair. But I'm actually interested in that because it inspires me to see how artwork itself is engaging, especially artwork that is intended to be culturally important, and how sometimes, especially in an art fair context, the business is the interest, but it's disconnected from the real world. And I'm there going, this custodian's interesting to me, more interesting than that painting that's supposed to be interesting to me. So I'm looking at the custodian, I'm following, and my favorite experience was not just following, but taking the photos, taking actually
the map of Sonamaco's layout,
drawing onto it an image of the person that I took a
photograph of, and then later on finding her with Ren.
By the way, this was not easy.
In the crowd.
He did this, and this story is told I've recently done a book with Ramiro, which will be out in April. But so this is the ending of the book of my text. Is there's a particular custodian that he did this picture of, and he wanted to give to her. So let's go find the custodian. It was not easy. It was ridiculous. Everywhere we turned, and it's quite fascinating. It's that Sartrean experience you have when you're looking for someone, and every person you look at isn't that person. It's not the person they are, but it's not that person. That person's not that person. That person's not that. And then we saw her at the end of an aisle, and then we went chasing after her. We got, and she disappeared again. I mean, that was her job, was to disappear. And finally, we found her.
We did find her, and when I did find her, I approached her, and it took her by surprise for sure. But what I noticed was her reaction to me of surprise gave way eventually as I communicated to her in Spanish that this drawing was made based on a photograph I took of her, to this sort of
Smirk?
A little smile, a little smile appears.
And yet for me, it wasn't about that feeling, you know, I just wanted to do it. I needed to do something while I was at that
fair, just to give again, and that's
my nature as an artist with the cardboard work or the magazine work. It's always about doing something and giving away, right? And
one of the funny things about the cardboard work is that he'll put them in front of Beverly Hills houses, and the owners will say to their workers, "Go get rid of that."
So let me ask you a question. Someone comes to you, a young activist comes to you and says, you know, what you're doing is really important. It's really important to bring these people forward. Why do we really need art to do this? I mean, why should we bother with art? Why not like pay attention to the janitors? I mean, couldn't we like, you know, have the janitors give talks? Can we just give money to the janitors and like skip the whole art thing entirely? I mean, why not let's turn over the project to let's just take my MacArthur and give it to all the women and have them make beads? Why do we need an exhibit of the piece?
Well,
I mean,
we don't. I mean, the thing is, I don't think, I mean, terrible thing to say, I don't think we do need art, to be honest. But we each have to do what it is we do. So
Is it possible to have a wrong answer? Because I think that's it.
No, but I think that we have to do what we do. So if you want to, you know, the question is really, how shall we then live? And how do we live meaningful lives? And if you're an artist and that's what you do and that's a gift or whatever, the thing that you have, then how can you do that in a meaningful way? And so for me, and I've thought about this so much, you know, why not just have a foundation? Why not just do this and this? But it's the thing that I do is make art. And so if I can marry the art that I make with, and make making have some kind of resonance or real world meaning, then it makes some sense.
But there's another option, which is, you know, you don't have to make art.
Right, just don't make art at all.
Just don't make art.
But since
just
I'm an
like
artist,
run this.
that's what I do. When you were busy taking your clothes
I
off.
was so excited. Okay, touche. Yeah, I mean, but why? I mean, you're saying it's a given that you're an artist, but why not just run a foundation and?
Because I'm an artist, I don't run a foundation.
Yes,
what I do.
but okay. If it's not important to be an artist, you're just saying you're doing it.
But it's what I do. It's me. It's important. It's important to me personally. What I make.
I think it's more than that, I have to say. I mean, I think that there's an argument to be made on art's behalf. And it's not just that I mean, one way to see the history of art is that there are a lot of bohemians who want to do something. And they're not the business people, they're the ones who want to make art. But there's another way to see it. This has been especially important to me in making the case for poetry. But it's really comparable. I don't think we have a history of poetry because there are a bunch of bohemians, you know, and oddballs in different cultures who want to write poetry, and they're just not be market driven. I think it's that poetry delivers a certain kind of knowledge that you can't get elsewhere, and that it has a way of bringing certain kinds of information forward you can't get in other places. Otherwise, we wouldn't have poetry in every culture. And I would say the same thing about visual art. I would say that it's not just because there are terrific people who are gifted at making images, but because art brings forward certain things visible that the culture needs, and it can't get it in other ways. In every culture, there's ornamentation. In every culture, there's visual art. That is a way of looking at things that is not utilitarian. There's always non-utilitarian ways of knowing in visual art. And I would think that that's because art carries a certain kind of information that you can't get in other aspects of culture.
Ramiro says it beautifully in the film that's in the other room. He says, if I had a rock and I wrote something on it that I wanted people to hear and I threw it at that person, they would just throw it back at me. But if I set my artwork there, it kind of whispers to them, it calls to them, and they approach it on their own and then they get something from it. I think
But I mean, the thing that's striking when you look at your paintings is not just that there are these workers that you can find who are not otherwise visible in paintings, it's that the painting is a beautiful painting and the person is there. If it were just, it's not just a portrait of a person, you're not just doing a portrait of a worker, which you could do, but that's not what you're doing. You're putting them in the landscape, and the landscape is beautiful to look at.
Exactly, and I really appreciate you paying attention to that quote. I do stand very firmly behind it. It matters how you say something, especially when it's so divisive, so polarizing, and the context of the work matters, but at the same time, there's a responsibility. I only do what I can do to reflect something that's really hard to explain and even begin the conversation. In fact, I argue sometimes that if I wasn't an artist, there's plenty of people out there. There's a National Domestic Workers Alliance actively working for domestic labor issues, not just here, but across the world. There's active people working, but I notice that it's a group effort. It's an ecosystem. So just because someone has a good think tank and data that is collected to push forth a domestic workers bill, doesn't mean the culture will immediately accept or come to it. And that's where the artist role comes in. Many of these institutions reach out to artists like us for the posters that women carry on their marches. In my case, I'm not seeing myself in that space, just as I don't see myself fully in the art space either. I'm more of a bridge. And I think that that's how I go forward is all of this is intuition. This is not something I set and planned. When I took the live-in nanny job, I took it out of necessity, but I didn't sit and set forth an effort to be an advocate. In fact, it's just by chance that that's occurred, but I don't think now, in retrospect, even that statement is true. It's not by chance. It's always something that feels almost premeditated or prearranged, if you will, even being here, being connected to Ren, being connected to you guys, being here in this moment, talking about something is just a part of how the world works. And no matter how small the effect, the way that I'm saying it matters. And I hope that I reach, if it's not through words, through a visual, through a moment, through a very subtle impact, like a image of a gardener that's already being seen. Because in the end, I'm not talking about anything that's invisible. In fact, it's highly visible. The only reason that it's connecting is because it's visible. Everybody sees it. It just hasn't been seen in the way that I'm doing. Now it allows for the conversation to continue, and that's where I'm seeing myself.
There's also, there is a lot of didactic art. And I would say your work doesn't strike me as being particularly didactic, either one of you, in terms of a lot of work I've seen that has very intensive political purposes. I mean, there's protest art. This strikes me as not being exactly that because of its, even though there's that, I'd say, purposeful didactic dimension to it, it's not primarily didactic because its ends are visual.
In terms of the relationship of art and politics, going back to poetry, you know the lines better than I do, but obviously there's pound, art is news that stays new. What is that?
Poetry is news that stays news.
Yeah. And then William Carlos Williams, you can't find...
It's difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found.
Which is one of the great uses of the word miserably.
Yeah.
miserably being misère is
That's
poverty.
an important
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
That's partly what I'm trying to say. It's difficult to get the news from poems. That is, it's easier to get the news in other ways. Yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there.
And also, you can't
It's the
get,
best argument for art that there could be.
and also, you can't get the news from the newspaper.
Right.
Or you only begin to get it, or these things can sensitize you to ways, yeah.
So you have this
Right.
hidden poem by Emily Dickinson in the kitchen. In 1862, Emily Dickinson was writing some of her greatest poems of self-division. We might say, politically, maybe Emily Dickinson should have been out there protesting the Civil War, writing Civil War poems against the greatest evil of slavery. I mean, there's a tremendous reason to do that. But you'd say American literature, American culture, we as people are tremendously enriched by the fact that Emily Dickinson did what she was supposed to do, which is using Civil War as metaphors for self-division and writing these absolutely immortal poems, which at the time seemed apolitical, and now we can see are extremely political.
Not to mention the fact that she didn't really leave home. So there's this kind of internal vision, this way of focusing on something so small that you reach the world. It's that Rilke thing.
And it can, yes, exactly, from the Duino elegies, the consequences of looking at something small that are just tremendously enlarged.
Another interesting thing, political thing with your work, Liza, which isn't directly political, but in a similar way, is if you don't mind my talking a little bit about your background, because at the end we will ask you to sing a gospel song when we end. Liza was raised in a, how do you want to describe it, fundamentalist, born-again, Christian, whatever.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Well, you would
Yeah.
describe, but
Yeah.
very, very, and think about what it is for, well, you have described it to me, and we have a conversation in her book about this, but a world entirely spangled, even after the immediate faith of her parents or that fell away.
But that was a spangled world. I mean,
That her world was a spangled world.
A born-again world is one where you see demons, and we would look at advertisements for alcohol, which I don't think you would do that now, but you look at the glass and then you'd see the demon inside it. It was something that we practiced, or listening to records backwards to hear the devil music. I mean, I can laugh about it now, but growing up in a way where you're always seeing more than what was, I think infused my experience of the world to always be looking around the corner for something, for an angel or for a demon or something transcendent to happen. And so it was a real natural fit. I mean, I remember really very clearly when I traded the church for the museum. It was a similar kind of baptism that it was a similar kind of apprenticeship that you had to start with, where you studied under the kind of the greats that went before you, the same way that you thought about, everything else, the angels, the disciples.
I'm really struck by that. First of all, it's beautiful, and I love what all of you are saying. But what I'm struck by is how you keep, in different ways, addressing the phenomenon of disappearing, like what would remain unseen if you didn't see it. The people working at the casinos, they're trained to disappear, and the way you did the work with these, like, so much disappears, and the work of the women who help you keeps disappearing, and then the art object that you end up with is some kind of testament to that, though what made it has disappeared already. The activity of making it, the activity of your own creative process and getting you to even imagine it, it's always disappearing. So what I get is how powerful the experience is of drawing attention to what disappears. That's what I hear you all speaking of. The poetry does the same thing. It's, like Emily Dickinson's poetry is like, in her experience, what she was speaking to was always disappearing. Nobody saw it and saw the full effect of it until now, in some ways. And so it's just so striking to me, the focus on the disappearance disappearing. And I wouldn't want to say disappearance. It's not. It's a verb that you're addressing. It's the experience of the human being that seems to touch all of us. And the reason your stuff is evocative is it touches that place in us that somehow feels the evanescence of reality. You're focusing on very particular pieces of that, but it brings the whole experience of that disappearance into our imagination by looking at your things. And so I'm so struck by the power of that you're naming or acknowledging or evoking.
Cézanne said, you have to hurry up if you're going to see everything is fast disappearing. And Eudora Welty said, it is art's job to make the real real, which is to say sociology, politics. Sociology will make the real numbers, political science will make the real this, economics says this, but it is the job of artists to make the real real.
I was just working in South Africa with my team, and I have to say that the women I work with are by now like family. And when you weave, because we do a lot of weaving now, when I first started I brought my way of working with beads, which is to glue things with the tweezers. But over time, I've listened to them, and I work now much more. We're sewing and weaving every day. And when you pass a needle under a thread, over and over together, there's a silence to that, and there's an invisibility. As you make it, the thread that holds everything that we make together is completely invisible. So there's this invisible web that holds everything together. And it's so much like the days of the way that our time is passing through. And so, although I don't try to, and I don't think the process of making art, you actually aren't even aware of what it is you're doing most of the time, I don't think. But it has another meaning that happens. And for me, that meaning, that silence or that invisibility is so powerful and sort of sad. There's an incredible sadness in it. The passing of time. And I think I'm very aware of it because so many of the women I work with, people have passed away in the time I've been there. And so their thread remains underneath everything. And yeah, I'm so pleased that you're hearing us talk about that, because I think it's in every one of our lives, no matter what it is you do.